Hi, this is Paul. Jordan Peterson has been in Dublin, and I had a little conversation with someone who watches my videos in Dublin about some of what went on. A lot of the ought-is question between Peterson and Sam Harris. But before Peterson did that, he did this interview, and there were some interesting things in this interview, and I want to play a little bit at the end because it gets into some of the Jordan Peterson watch type conversation. What's going on with him? Where's this going? So I'm just gonna play it at the end, play it till the end, and then comment on some of the points that he makes.
You've spoken about kind of recently about just disappearing from public life to a certain degree at some point. Is that something you see happening more and more, of just backing away from the limelight
the thing
and going
is
and living
that,
your life?
well, it isn't even that I want to go live my life. It's that at some point, there's the problems that we talked about earlier. There's an overexposure problem and there's a repetition problem. Like, I have a fairly wide range of things to talk about, but it's not inexhaustible. And once I've talked about all those things, talking about them a bunch more is going to become counterproductive. So what I need to do is go away and read and think and come up with a bunch of new ideas. Now, I'm going to handle that to some degree because the next lecture series that I'm going to do will be on Exodus. I did a biblical series last year on Genesis, and that was quite popular. And I think quite necessary, certainly necessary for me because it was a good intellectual and ethical endeavor. I want to go through the Exodus stories next, and that'll be new. But I need to balance communication with thinking and the generation of new ideas. And I'm going to finish up this tour sequence probably mostly by February. I'm going to come back to Europe probably next April for a bit. And then I think I have 1,000 books at home that are sitting there waiting to be read.
Is that how you unwind? Do you unwind? Do you relax?
Mostly the way I unwind is by spending time with my family. I wouldn't, but no, there's very little of that. And there hasn't been much of that in my whole life, and there's certainly been none of it in the last 2 years. I mean, I haven't had any time off of any duration for 2 years, and not very much of it before then. But I'm not complaining about that. Like, I function better flat out. I mean, I need to pull back a bit because I have some reading to do and some thinking and all of that, but I'm not complaining. I mean, I've got nothing to complain about. It's very, how should you conceptualize your life? Peace and tranquility? I don't think so. I think if you're lucky, your life is an adventure, and hopefully it's one you undertook voluntarily. And an adventure isn't leisure and tranquility. It's alertness and readiness. And that's fine. I think that's the best you get, is that you're contending. You're contending with life successfully. And so that's the situation that I'm in, and that's fine. But it will be good and proper at some point to pull back enough so that I can read and think and write more. So, but I will do that, I believe.
So if you do pull back at some point, that's exactly what you're going to be doing?
Oh, definitely, yeah. I'm writing right now. I wrote a lot. Well, I'm going to post some of it today about this ongoing discussion with Sam Harris. So, but isn't that I like writing exactly, because it's too hard to be something that you like exactly, but it's something that I find necessary and intensely engaging. I have a writer friend. His name is Greg Hurwitz. He featured some of my rules in one of his books, an Orphan X book. And he's been writing nonstop for 25 years. He's written a bestseller every year for 25 years. He said, he's involved in many projects, he said the only time he really feels like he's accomplished something is when he's writing. And I kind of feel that way too. Like, if I've written during the day, then I really feel like I've done something that justified the day. And lecturing is like that, and clinical work is like that, but writing is definitely like that. So I'm looking forward to doing a bunch more of that. And so,
Jordan Peterson, I could genuinely...
Now there are a number of other interesting things in this talk that they do. I thought earlier in the talk he has a lot of political stuff on Donald Trump, and the Delve did some of their own editing to put some of those individual videos out there, and I see a lot of them are over 100,000 views, so people have keyed in on that. Some of that it was just an interesting interview with a lot of chatting about some other things that we don't often hear Peterson talk about. I thought he had his treatment of hierarchies was one of the clearest I think I've heard him do, or perhaps I'm just getting clearer and clearer on what his teaching is, and so when he talks it's more and more obvious to me. One of the points that I made a couple videos ago was that repetition and study. Now, as I'm going back and listening to some of his biblical series on Genesis again, I hear him with different ears and I understand him better. But there are a number of things in this video I regularly get in comments and in emails and Facebook messages, the oversaturation comment. I get that in the meetup. I've been getting that in the meetup for months, actually. And Peterson talks about this, the overexposure problem. Boy, your YouTube feed is full of him. He's clearly not doing as many interviews, especially print interviews, as he was before. He's gotten burned recently on that quite a bit. And a little bit later in the week, I'm going to post the conversation that he did with a friend of mine from Fresno. And I'll post that a little later in the week. My friend actually has posted it already on his webpage. There's the repetition problem that as Peterson's audience gets broader and broader, he has to keep repeating himself and saying the same thing over and over again. I think about, let's say, bands from the 70s and 80s that had a number of hits and they go on tour for the next 30 years and they keep playing the same song over and over and over again because that's what people want to hear. Whereas the more hardcore fans, get sick of hearing this song. I want to hear new songs. So he wants time to read and to think and create. He's talking about the biblical series, starting that again in November. The question I have about what he's going to do with that series is whether he's going to take it on the road or if he's going to keep using the Bader Theater in Toronto. He hasn't talked publicly about his relationship with the University of Toronto, if he's on leave. What will that relationship be going forward? And this gets into the question of where is Peterson going, how to think about Peterson, how to frame him. Earlier on, I compared him not as being the same, but compared him to, let's say, Billy Graham. Billy Graham left an institution in his wake, and when Billy Graham was doing his work, he very much wanted to start a movement, and so he engaged local churches, and a big part of what the Billy Graham Evangelistic Organization did was network with local churches to really turn something into a movement. Peterson seems much more a John the Baptist type, and I've mentioned that before. John the Baptist was a big movement in the first century, and the influence of John the Baptist, there were followers into the 2nd and 3rd century of John the Baptist that still connected with his ministry. But let's say comparing John the Baptist with Jesus, John the Baptist declined, and of course Jesus has continued to grow throughout the world now. So it's going to be very interesting. Again, often some interesting conversation with individuals on where's this going. Peterson doesn't seem to be interested in forming institutions. He doesn't even necessarily seem all that interested in fomenting a movement. He seems more interested in doing exactly what he's doing, which is going to places and giving talks. And when you look at his book events, those really aren't book events. They're much more, he's getting on stage and he is connecting with his audience and he is giving them the thoughts of the day and doing a question and answer and then the VIP picture taken, which I think for him is a very life-giving exercise where he's meeting people, and I think he gets rejuvenated. And if you look at his schedule, he's covering an enormous number of cities. It's almost every night another city, and he genuinely seems to find this not wearing or taxing, but invigorating, especially as compared to interviews with the New York Times or some of these other major publications that are basically going to take whatever they get from him and devise a little hit piece. I think the level of the media, the mainstream media attention span is very short, and so Peterson just kind of hit that span. I also try to ask normal people, and when I say normal people, people who are not paying a lot of attention to Jordan Peterson, what they know about him. And in many ways, the hit jobs that have been done on him, I think, have had their effect. People who have never watched any of his videos, have never read his book, but just can identify the name, have basically a very low resolution association. Jordan Peterson, right-winger, misogynist, boom, 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 those kinds of things. And so I think the hit jobs have done their effect on him, while many of the Jordan Peters, those who have invested in the videos and appreciated his work, many of them have stopped. They're keeping an eye on him, but they've stopped watching videos and they've stopped investing. They feel like they've heard him already. Many are waiting for the biblical series to come out again. Some are watching the Sam Harris These conversations, but my sense is that that's increasingly spent too. And Brett Weinstein had his conversation on the Pangburn stuff. My sense is that, Pangburn, if they wanted to put this stuff out when the iron was hot, wait a few days, but then put it out. And this long period of delay, I think by the time Pangburn puts them out, only the hardest core Jordan Peterson people are going to go back and watch them, because that moment will have already passed. And I also don't know that the Sam Harris Jordan Peterson kind of technical philosophical conversation is really the sweet spot in terms of the interest in Jordan Peterson. Now, I might be wrong on that because of the skewed sample that comes to me. Because I'm a pastor, I'll tend to get much more of the biblical series, the theological, the religious interest conversation than necessarily the tit-for-tat debate with Sam Harris. And both Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson have kind of tried to defuse the zero-sum game that many want to pose that as. And so it's just interesting watching that. And so Peterson says the biblical series in Exodus, and it would be very interesting if he just has the Bader Theater in Toronto, or if he looks for larger venues and decides to take the biblical series on the road and say do one in Toronto in a much bigger venue. And then, in other words, take what he's doing in the book tour and do that in his biblical series. I don't see, and this is the weakness of him not building an organization or an institution, because I've been in conversation with people spending a lot of attention looking at, okay, he's probably got upcoming book deals that he's working on. If you sell a book this large, publishers are going to be all over you, crying and demanding your next book, and they want it now, and they want to get it out there, and that's the way the market works. So, in Peterson, when he's been doing this book series, my impression is that he's using just standard promoters, OMG, VIP, he's using them. Which, if you don't have an infrastructure, if you haven't built an organization around you, you are dependent upon off-the-shelf promoters and this kind of thing. Now, again, so now when he rolls out the biblical series, what will that look like? If he builds an organization around him and an institution, well, okay. If I were advising him, I would recommend building an organization and an institution, in fact, coming at this from a church point of view, which is, in a sense, Billy Graham came at it from a little different point of view, but knowing what I do about movements and people and all this kind of thing, I would probably approach some of this in a different way. Now, it could be that Peterson is just doing what he wants. It could be that this is the best way to financially take advantage of this. But again, my read on Peterson is not that this is all about the money. Not that the money isn't lovely for him. He's setting up his retirement nicely, I'm assuming. He's no longer dependent upon University of Toronto. But for him, it's the mission. But getting the sense of what he sees his mission in, I almost get the sense that for Peterson, Okay, he talks in this video kind of about the hero's journey. He casts himself as the hero, and as someone recently said to me, he almost, sometimes in some interviews, he almost sounds like he wants to be martyred. And so then again, I think back on the John the Baptist, where, he's waiting for Herod to come and take his head. And I don't think Herod is going to come and take Jordan Peterson's head. We're not living in the first century Judean culture war. And so the question will be, will Peterson kind of rise and in the public sphere have his moment? In January 2018, David Brooks entitled his New York Times piece on Peterson, the Jordan Peterson moment. Are we past that moment? Now, that doesn't mean he's not going to have a tail end of devoted fans, but it could be that, in a sense, his impact has peaked. Now, one of the things that you learn as a pastor is that if you have a narrative arc and you're not satisfied with what you've accomplished in that narrative arc, the way to change it is to do something different. You have to do something different. And so that would be for Peterson, well, what did Donald Trump do? Donald Trump decided to run for office. And I think in some ways, I got to be careful with this one because, again, Donald Trump is he who must not be named. The way Donald Trump ran for president was almost Jordan Peterson-esque in terms of, I'm going to try this now and see what happens. And lo and behold, he's elected president. So I'll try North Korea now, and I'll try Putin now. And this gets into the whole Trump. Is he the evil genius? Is he the idiot? Is he mindless? Whatever you think of Donald Trump, Peterson, I get the sense, is taking this one step at a time. And Peterson does not necessarily have a master vision. And he's a clinical psychologist, which he'll tell you again and again. And he's learning as he goes on this tour. But just listening to this interview, you're hearing a college professor who's also a clinical psychologist. Billy Graham, who worked in the church and was a pastor, evangelist, approached his mission very differently. And this is where, again, there's lots of layers to who we are. And in a sense, this is the Peterson we'll get. Now, will he change? Will he find a new gear? Will he do something else? He's got a self-authoring program, the Discover Yourself. I forget what it is, the Big 5 test program. He talked about a university. But again, if you say compare Jordan Peterson to Jonathan Haidt, Jonathan Haidt has pursued his mission very differently. Now, Jonathan's books, I don't think Jonathan wrote books that were as pitched to a popular audience. This was what Peterson learned with his Quora adventure. So again, Peterson's a different person. And so when you start comparing Peterson to, let's say, Billy Graham, or start comparing Peterson to Jonathan Haidt, or start comparing Peterson to Donald Trump, or maybe one of the Fords in Ontario politics, you can begin to see the differences in terms of what decisions is he making, where is he going with this. And again, when he gets back into the biblical series, for him, Peterson talked about that, and I thought the terms he used were a good intellectual and ethical endeavor. Those aren't the kind of terms a pastor would use. Those aren't the kind of terms an evangelist would use. And now he mentioned that the biblical series were popular. This is all very, very interesting. And so now I think he's sensing he's reaching the end of an arc. But then when he says when the arc is ending, February 2019, that's a long ways away in this culture. And so part of me wonders, with so many Jordan Peterson people whose interest he caught in mid 2017, early 2018, to what degree is this long arc spent? Now he's continuing to sell out places. It's also the case that maybe myself, well, I'm an obsessive person because I'm still with him, and I'm not showing any interest of letting up. But for many of the people I'm talking to, I mean, some people say, well, I watch your videos more than I watch his, and if there's something happens in Jordan Peterson land, you'll tell me. So that gives me an indication of where they're at. Seen it, done it, integrated it, at least to the degree that they feel satisfied by the integration and are moving on and looking for the next thing. And of course, this is where you have the difference between platforms and performers. Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Douglas Murray, whoever the next big thing is, Google wins no matter what, because that's what it means to be a platform. And they have obviously some sort of a symbiotic relationship, but this is the nature of that game. And so I have the question, February 2019, well, the biblical series starts November 2018, and I'm very excited to find out what the reception to the biblical series will be, and I'm very anxious to see how he sets this up. You know, is he gonna have Dave Rubin come on stage and warm up for the biblical series? That doesn't seem right. I don't know. I'm going to watch very interesting how he frames this, because depending on how he frames it, it says a lot about what he's trying to do. Will the biblical series just be, as he declared for the Genesis series, just kind of a, and in this case now, profitable and popular way to think out loud? He did that for Genesis. Will that be received in the same way for Exodus? Remember, you don't step in the same river twice. You don't even step in it in the same river once. And the speed of popular culture today means whoosh. So the Jordan Peterson that starts the biblical series in November will, if he starts in November, because, yeah, I don't have, again, and this isn't a knock against him, he doesn't seem to be a planner. He is not working out a master strategy in order to, if he's going to be the savior of Western civilization, one would hope he would be a little more strategic. Now, he's been fortunate, Calvinists would say providential, in terms of his success so far, and all of his fights have been, he has done well in them, but we really haven't seen a fight since then, and the decision to kind of hitch the Sam Harris Pangburn thing with the long delay and not really managing that. You know, I wonder, Brett Weinstein has obviously spoken out on it. Peterson is blogging about it, but hitching his wagon to Pangburn and the Pangburn decisions that have been made, have those really served Peterson and Harris? And Brett Weinstein seems to say no, he doesn't think they've served the conversation. Will by November 2018 the intellectual dark web already be passé? How about February 2019? Will in April of 2019, if Jordan Peterson, let me make a reference to Phil Vischer. A few of you will know who Phil Vischer is. Most of you won't. Phil Vischer was the creator of VeggieTales, and I'll just pull up the website. Okay, this is Phil Vischer. Phil Vischer was the creator of VeggieTales, and I guess for a lot of the audience, you know what VeggieTales was. VeggieTales was huge, and Phil Vischer was explaining the Bible to America, and Phil Vischer basically became Sunday school material through VeggieTales, and Phil Vischer lost Larry and Bob in bankruptcy court because he tried to go big and it was a disaster. And if you're curious about it, you can read Phil Vischer's book, Me, Myself, and Bob. Fascinating book. I'm sure you can Google Phil Vischer's story and find him on the internet. But Phil Vischer, when he was on the rise, he could do no wrong. And Phil's still out there and he's doing different things. He's got a little podcast that he does, and he did some DVDs, What's in the Bible, and he's playing with puppets, and he's trying to, but right now he's just trying to make ends meet, whereas I don't have the timing in my head, but early on in the 90s, during the transition from VHS to DVD, which he totally messed up. I mean, he didn't have the kind of legal advice that would help him keep Larry and Bob. And it's an amazing story, but it's an incredible story just in terms of a little lesson about you can rise high and fast and there's no telling what's going to happen to you. Now, I don't think Peterson's going to lose anything in bankruptcy court because Peterson is just Peterson. But let's imagine he says, well, let's take the biblical series on the road, and he starts, and he, this is in a sense the reason why he was safe. He's been safe in terms of rolling himself the way he has. And I'm no expert in this, mind you, and there's some of you people out there who know a lot more about this, so go ahead and wade in the comments. But we have no idea where this is going. Okay, so here's a scenario. Let's say Peterson says, I'm going to take my biblical series on the road, and I would think that's an amazing thing. So then he starts renting 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 seat venues, and he has to have obviously booked these months in advance. And then he does this, and he's on the hook for the rental of these places. And he, in his first one, let's say he goes to, he wouldn't come to Sacramento. Let's say he goes to the Bay Area or LA, rents the Staples Center because he thinks he can sell it out, and only 5,000 people show. Boom, you're going to lose a ton of money. And you've already, this is where, as scale goes, it gets tricky. So maybe I don't know anything about this because I've never done anything about this, but I do know something about church planting, and I do know something about Christian ministry, and I do know something about that when you get up to a certain size, there's scale and risk, and who knows what's going to happen to him. So he's got 1,000 books waiting to be read, which I believe because I've told him some of those, and just the number of books that have been sent to me, I can't imagine the books that have been sent to him. Do you unwind that way? The interviewer says, spending time with my family. There hasn't been much of that my whole life. I heard that and I thought, you're a clinical psychologist. You got to take care of yourself, dude. And I function better flat out. Yeah, I see that. Nothing to complain about. No, he's enjoying it. He's got the ride of his life. And then this interesting section on conceptualize your life. Peace and tranquility? No. Better as a voluntary adventure. And of course, this is totally Peterson-esque. Not leisure and tranquility, rather alertness and adventure, contending with life. This is Peterson has postmodern neo-Marxism, and he's grappling with it, and he's carrying his heavy cross uphill, and even if he's not quite sure what's at the top of the hill, but he's underway. And some interesting comments about writing. This is going to be interesting because, and again, I've likened this to new preachers. Sometimes I train people to preach and I give them a shot, and they've got one sermon in them, and after their sermon, they're kind of spent and say, okay, let's start working on the next one. But their first sermon was kind of their life story, and, well, this is where at some point, Peterson is a brilliant man. He's an integral thinker. He's bringing a lot of things together. Going through Maps of Meaning now, and a lot of the Peterson stuff. And I read 12 Rules for Life and a lot of the Peterson stuff. And so you have the question, how much other stuff? And this is where I, as a preacher, if you rely on this Bible, and if you actually study it, the Bible can continue to give you new information. And the Bible has done this throughout human history again and again and again and again and again. And if you look at almost all church revival movements, many of them go back to the Bible, find new things in it, and then a new movement grows. So I think his strategy of using the Bible in this way is a brilliant one. It's worked for preachers throughout. And then you have the question of, what is he really? Is he a preacher? Is he an evangelist? Is he a psychologist? Does he fashion himself a prophet? And that word has come up often, the Scott Alexander piece on him. And I think in many ways, John the Baptist, that's kind of what is going on. But now we'll have to see. So feels like he accomplishes something when he's writing, lecturing and clinical work too, but especially writing. That was very telling. So, half hour. That's not too bad for me because I ramble, and yes, I rambled. I was hoping it'd be more like 15 minutes, but I can't do that. So, again, just a few takes on this interview, and I know some of you are really bored by the soap opera aspect of the Jordan Peterson story. I'm not bored by it. I'm watching, and it's the Truman Show, and you're just wondering, how's this going to end? We'll see. Don't think there's a hair around that's going to take off his head.